So, hobbies, cooking, painting, movies, crystal meth, what are yours? Well, I'm sure that perhaps all of you who played Far Cry 3 remember this famous quote by Hoyt Walker. Anyway, joke aside, let's look at methamphetamine, also known as crystal meth, a popular drug of abuse amongst video game characters as well as movie characters and drug users alike. Now, before we dive in, I'd like to give you a quick meth intro. So, methamphetamine is a potent stimulant affecting both the central and peripheral nervous systems. It was first synthesized in its free-base form in Japan in 1893 by chemist Nagai Nagayoshi. In 1919, Japanese chemist Okira Agota resynthesized methamphetamine, only this time in its crystalline hydrochloride form, using a groundbreaking yet straightforward method involving the reduction of ephedrine using red phosphorus and iodine. This synthesis method remains one of the most popular ways to make meth, especially in countries with abundant ephedrine and pseudoephedrine supplies, like my home country, the Czech Republic. Turning to history again. Methamphetamine gained notoriety in Nazi Germany, especially between 1938 and 1941. The German army's use of methamphetamine in the form of pervitin pills contributed to their rapid advances. By 1940, they had conquered the entire Benelux region and France within just 6 weeks, thanks in part to widespread meth use, allowing soldiers to operate without sleep or rest. In addition, meth was even available to the German public without a prescription, at least up until 1941. And yeah, by the way, the Führer himself was not shy about getting high on meth every day either, as he was receiving daily intravenous doses from his personal physician Dr. Theodor Morel. However, Hitler's long-term substance abuse, including methamphetamine, likely contributed to his deteriorating health, displaying symptoms of methamphetamine-induced neurotoxicity resembling the symptoms of Parkinson's disease by the end of the Second World War. Aside from Germans, the Japanese also utilized crystal meth extensively, with kamikaze pilots reputedly taking the drug before their final flights. And in a similar fashion to Germany, methamphetamine was also accessible to Japanese civilians without prescription. Anyway, let's skip the rest of the history for now, and instead let's focus on the chemical properties of crystal meth. For a deeper dive into the history of amphetamine and methamphetamine use, feel free to visit the Drug Library portal and explore my article discussing amphetamine. Methamphetamine is primarily categorized as a central nervous stimulant. In a similar fashion to its cousin amphetamine, it too belongs to the phenethylamine chemical class, which is undoubtedly apparent when looking at its molecular structure. In fact, methamphetamine's molecule differs only by the addition of a methyl group at the very end of the amine chain. Hence, methamphetamine is sometimes termed as N-methylamphetamine. Its chemical formula C10H15N highlights its composition of 10 carbon atoms, 15 hydrogen atoms, and 1 nitrogen atom. Moreover, its molar mass equates to 149.2 grams per mole. And just like amphetamine, methamphetamine comprises 2 optical stereoisomers, namely dextromethamphetamine, which acts as a stronger psychostimulant, and then levomethamphetamine, which exerts a more pronounced effect on the peripheral nervous system. Furthermore, its boiling point stands at 212 degrees Celsius under 1 atmosphere, and its free-base form appears as a colorless volatile oil, practically indistinguishable from free-base amphetamine. In this instance, meth is only soluble in organic solvents. In any case, in recreational settings, methamphetamine hydrochloride sulfate is the most prevalent form, often found in the form of white to transparent crystals or crystalline powder. On a side note, methamphetamine hydrochloride is also available as a prescription medicine in the US under the trade name Dasaxin for conditions like ADHD and obesity. Nonetheless, its use is typically secondary after standard treatment fails. In general, medical methamphetamine has largely been replaced by safer alternatives such as regular amphetamine or methylphenidate due to abuse and neurotoxicity concerns. Aside from that, methamphetamine production is notorious for its simplicity, with amateur labs sometimes literally operating in kitchens, which is quite often the case in amateur meth labs found in Czechia. Starting materials include P2P as featured in Breaking Bad or ephedrine or pseudoephedrine. As depicted in the picture on the right side, various synthesis methods are available, including Leucid method, reductive amination, Birch reduction, Nagel method, Rosamund method, and Amt method. Among these, the Leucid method, reductive amination, and Birch reduction are most commonly employed due to their straightforward procedures, manageable even for amateurs who grasp the proper cooking temperature and sequence. Ultimately, all mentioned methods yield a racemic mixture of methamphetamine hydrochloride sulfate. Before I start with this section, I would like to inform you that I won't be delving into all the information presented on this slide due to time constraints. Hence, if you'd be interested in reading more about this stuff, feel free to pause the video to review the full details on the slide. Lovely, with that out of our way, let's explore the oral pharmacokinetics of methamphetamine. So when taken orally, methamphetamine demonstrates a bioavailability of approximately 67%, meaning about 2/3 of the ingested dose reaches systematic circulation. The time to reach peak plasma concentration, Tmax for short, typically ranges from 2 to 4 hours, with an average of 216 minutes. This indicates that the onset of the peak effects generally occurs around 3 hours post-ingestion. The overall duration of action for oral methamphetamine is approximately 8 to 12 hours, though inexperienced users may experience effects for up to 24 hours. The drug's protein binding capacity varies significantly among individuals. Furthermore, orally administered methamphetamine has a biological half-life of approximately 9.1 hours on average, while a terminal half-life stands around 10 hours. The metabolism primarily occurs in the liver, facilitated by enzymes CYP2D6 and FMO3. After metabolism, the drug is then primarily excreted through the kidneys. Much like amphetamine, methamphetamine shares a similar pharmacological profile. This is why I've utilized the pharmacological scheme from my previous video about amphetamine. Anyway, methamphetamine primarily acts as a reuptake inhibitor, in other words, a blocker and releasing agent of dopamine, noradrenaline, and serotonin. In order to understand how it achieves this effect, let's break it down piece by piece. So firstly, when methamphetamine gets into the CNS, it competes with dopamine, noradrenaline, and serotonin in binding to their respective transporters, DAT, NET, and SERT for short. This means that when methamphetamine CNS concentrations are high enough, it outcompetes these neurotransmitters for binding to the transporters, thus causing their competitive reuptake inhibition. Once bound onto these transporters, methamphetamine enters the monoamine presynaptic neuron, either through the transporter itself or via passive diffusion. Inside the neuron, methamphetamine inhibits the function of the vesicular VMAT2 transporter, allowing it to enter the vesicle. Moreover, within the vesicle, methamphetamine then disrupts the pH gradient, leading to a massive release of monoamine neurotransmitters into the cytosol. Furthermore, methamphetamine also activates presynaptic intracellular TOR1 monoamine receptors. This activation then triggers the phosphorylation of monoamine transporters through intracellular pKa and pKc dependent signaling pathways. As a side note, pKa and pKc are enzymes within the cell that modify the function of target proteins, including monoamine transporters. Anyway, phosphorylation by pKa leads to non-competitive inhibition of the transporter, preventing the reuptake of monoamines from the intersynaptic gap. On the other hand, phosphorylation by pKc may induce transporter reversal, releasing intracellular monoamines into the synaptic gap. Additionally, methamphetamine increases intracellular calcium levels, thus activating the CAMK2 alpha enzyme. This further contributes to dopamine transporter phosphorylation, augmenting its reversal. Following these events, accumulated monoamines are released into the synaptic gap, binding to receptors on the postsynaptic neurons. This results in heightened monoamine system activity, resulting in several typical symptoms of methamphetamine intoxication, such as mental and physical stimulation. Lastly, methamphetamine's activation of intracellular TAR1 monoamine receptors reduces dopamine firing rate, particularly in the ventral tegmental area, thus helping to prevent hyperdopaminergic state. Similarly to other drugs of abuse, methamphetamine also affects other brain systems and receptors. For instance, it binds and activates alpha-2A, B, and C adrenergic receptors, which contribute to the production of psychophysiological stimulation. Additionally, methamphetamine's dopamine release also triggers simultaneous glutamate release, leading to long-term addiction-related changes in neuroplasticity, which contributes to the manifestation of cravings upon cessation. Methamphetamine also targets sigma-1 and 2 receptors, which, like adenosine receptors, do not belong to any particular system and instead have their own category. Activation of these receptors induces locomotor stimulation, drug sensitization, and neurotoxicity, particularly with prolonged activation. In a similar fashion to amphetamine, methamphetamine can also competitively block MAOA and B enzymes at high CNS concentrations, thus further elevating monoamine activity in the brain. Moreover, methamphetamine seems to interact with the brain's endogenous opioid pathway, as human research indicates that the administration of opioid antagonist naloxone partially blocks methamphetamine's rewarding effects, thus indicating that methamphetamine administration may induce the release of endogenous opioids such as beta-endorphins and methenkephalins. These substances then biochemically activate the brain's hedonic hotspots, resulting in a strong surge of euphoria. Also, as depicted in a figure, while substances like endogenous opioids and cannabinoids produce euphoria, the liking reaction, the desire to seek and take the drug, the wanting reaction, is driven by the dopaminergic pathway, specifically by its increased activity after taking the drug itself. In a similar fashion to MDMA, extended usage of methamphetamine can lead to neural damage, with dopaminergic neurons being particularly susceptible. Nevertheless, prolonged and excessive use of meth may even result in serotonergic neurotoxicity. Interestingly, the symptoms of meth-induced neurotoxicity bear resemblance to those of Parkinson's disease, although the underlying mechanism differs significantly. In any case, some studies suggest that with prolonged abstinence around 12 months or more, the brain can at least partially recover. However, some other research even suggests that long-term abstinence may fully reverse meth-induced neural damage. Be that as it may, I strongly advise against testing this by exposing oneself to neurotoxic doses of methamphetamine, as high doses may also impact other bodily systems, notably the cardiovascular system, which may fall prey to meth-induced cardiotoxicity. Therefore, when using this substance, it's crucial to adhere to harm reduction principles, such as using the drug orally in low doses and taking extended breaks, preferably several months, between each session. Now let's return to primary focus of this section. To understand how methamphetamine can harm the brain when used irresponsibly, consider the first image on the left, illustrating meth-induced oxidative stress in genetically modified rats, captured via neuroimaging. As shown in condition group F, meth-induced oxidative stress can literally light up your brain, at least when using the fluorescence neuroimaging technique. In any case, even common doses of meth induce oxidative stress, whereby long-term exposure to it seems to be one of the key factors contributing to the development of neurotoxicity. Besides that, research also identified 3 additional contributors, namely activation of sigma-1 and 2 receptors, excessive release of glutamate leading to excitatory neural death, and neural inflammation regulated by sigma receptor activation and increased intracellular NF-kappa B protein activity, among other pathological intracellular mechanisms. It's also worth noting that meth-induced neurotoxicity shares similarities with other neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's disease. This can be clearly seen in the second and third pictures, depicting a computational neural map based on neuroimaging data from individuals with Alzheimer's disease and those with meth-induced neurotoxicity. Despite differing mechanisms, both disorders exhibit remarkable similarities in terms of affected brain regions, particularly those involved in regulating emotions, reward, and memory. This is particularly evident when comparing a neural map illustrating the progression of Alzheimer's disease during the 18th month with the neural map depicting brain damage induced by methamphetamine. Methamphetamine undergoes primary metabolism in the liver, mediated by cytochrome P450 enzymes. The key enzymes responsible for this conversion are CYP2D6 and then, to a lesser extent, FMO3. Additionally, methamphetamine also undergoes metabolic processing in other tissues, including the brain, where it is metabolized by dopamine beta hydroxylase and then, to a lesser extent, by monoamine oxidase enzymes, MAO for short. Nevertheless, due to high lipophilicity, methamphetamine is much more resistant to MAO-regulated degradation. Plus, in high enough CNS concentrations, meth actually can block the activity of these enzymes. Other enzymes involved in methamphetamine metabolism in various tissues include butyrate CoA ligase and GLY8E. The overall metabolic conversion involves three primary pathways, including N-demethylation, leading to the creation of amphetamine, aromatic hydroxylation, producing para-hydroxymethamphetamine and para-hydroxyamphetamine, and beta-hydroxylation, yielding para-hydroxynorephédrine and norephédrine. Just as a side note, more than 50% of total plasma clearance of methamphetamine is attributed to metabolic clearance. When it comes to the detectable metabolites in human urine, the primary one is para-hydroxymethamphetamine, which acts as a sympathetic agent and shares a similar pharmacological profile with para-hydroxyamphetamine. The second most prominent active metabolite is then amphetamine, which acts as both a central nervous system and peripheral nervous system stimulant, possessing a pharmacological profile akin to methamphetamine. Other active metabolites with sympathetic properties include para-hydroxyamphetamine, para-hydroxynorephédrine, and norephédrine. On the other hand, inactive metabolites include para-hydroxyphenylacetone, benzoic acid, hippuric acid, and phenylacetone. Methamphetamine is typically excreted from the body within 20 to 24 hours following administration. However, even after 72 hours, metabolites can still be detected. In a similar manner to amphetamine, the overall biological half-life and excretion rate is heavily influenced by urine pH levels. Hence, as depicted on a diagram, highly alkaline urine significantly prolongs the biological half-life and simultaneously reduces the excretion rate. This is also followed by lower levels of unchanged methamphetamine in the urine and high levels of traceable active and inactive metabolites. Conversely, acidic urine shortens the biological half-life and accelerates excretion, whereby this also results in higher levels of unchanged methamphetamine and lower levels of metabolites in the urine. Altogether, both the metabolism and excretion of methamphetamine can be impaired in individuals with liver disease, kidney problems, children, and pregnant women. And as a bonus, you may also explore the percentage of detectable amounts of methamphetamine, amphetamine, and other metabolites in urine with normal pH levels across different methods of administration, including oral, intravenous, and inhalation methods. For those who are interested in this sort of stuff, I've prepared a section on methamphetamine detection time in plasma, saliva, and urine. In any case, I won't delve into this topic any further, as there are other important sections that need to be dissected and which are ahead of us. Hence, feel free to pause the video to read through it at your convenience. I will instead shift the focus to the mechanism of the metabolic inhibition triggered by methamphetamine, which may result in significant interaction with various other substances that share the metabolic pathway with crystal meth. According to current evidence, methamphetamine acts as both a weak substrate and a competitive inhibitor of the CYP2D6 enzyme. This means that in sufficiently high concentrations, it can temporarily block the activity of the CYP2D6 enzyme, affecting the metabolism of around 20 to 30% of medically used drugs, either enhancing or decreasing their efficacy. To grasp this type of inhibition, let's examine the figure on the right, which illustrates three different types of metabolic inhibitions. The first type is competitive reversible inhibition, where one substance outcompetes another for the active enzyme site due to its high concentration, causing temporary enzymatic inhibition. So, for instance, if you would take a strong substrate and inhibitor of CYP2D6 enzyme, like bupropion, before using high doses of methamphetamine, this could then result in meth outcompeting bupropion and blocking the enzyme before it can attach to it, potentially altering bupropion's metabolic rate and enhancing its pharmacological effects. Now let's also briefly discuss the other two types of enzymatic inhibitions. The second type is non-competitive reversible inhibition, where a substrate inhibitor binds to an allosteric site on the enzyme, which causes conformational changes and prevents another substrate from binding. In this case, the concentration of a second inhibitor is completely irrelevant, as the conformational enzymatic change induced by the first inhibitor on the allosteric site completely prevents the second inhibitor from binding to the enzyme, well, at least until the first inhibitor is flushed out from the allosteric side. The last type is irreversible mechanism-based inhibition, where the inhibitor binds to the enzyme's active site, forming stable intermediate enzyme complexes or reactive species, which completely locks up or destroys the enzyme, thus requiring new enzyme synthesis to restore enzymatic activity. Okay, now let's get back to the main topic of this section. So as mentioned, methamphetamine may impact the metabolism of various clinically used drugs. Hence, it comes as no surprise that it can also do the same for recreational drugs. As such, it is highly advisable to avoid combining meth with other CYP2D6 inhibitors or drugs metabolized by this enzyme, including MDMA, opiates, opioids, and kratom, which contains mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine, which both act as inhibitors of this enzyme. In addition, caution should also be exercised with medications like bupropion or HIV drugs, such as ritonavir, which acts as a very potent CYP2D6 inhibitor. As a side note, it's also worth mentioning that individuals with lower CYP2D6 activity may face a higher risk of methamphetamine-induced neurotoxicity due to reduced conversion into inactive metabolites. Such individuals may also be at a greater risk of experiencing undesirable effects, even with common doses due to increased concentrations of meth in their brains. Nevertheless, if anything, research shows that these individuals are less likely to develop methamphetamine dependency, presumably due to a higher likelihood of experiencing negative effects. On the other hand, those with increased CYP2D6 activity seem to be at a lower risk of developing neurotoxicity. However, at the same time, they are more likely to develop a dependency, especially with frequent use. Interestingly, one contemporary study concluded that heightened CYP2D6 enzyme activity in chronic methamphetamine users is associated with increased levels of structural brain deficits. Methamphetamine can be administered through various methods, each carrying its own risks and effects. So let's explore these methods. The first method is oral, which involves swallowing methamphetamine directly or mixing it with liquid. This method is considerably the safest one and is often preferred by occasional users. However, chronic users may require higher doses due to their higher tolerance. Just be aware that it may take about 90 minutes to feel the peak effects, posing a risk of overdose if the user takes additional dose too soon. An additional mode of use is an intranasal route, where the user snorts methamphetamine through the nose using a banknote or straw. While popular among occasional users, it's less safe than oral administration, as it involves a risk of damaging the nasal mucosa and can also lead to infections, especially if users share snorting equipment. Another method of use is via inhalation, which involves inhaling methamphetamine vapors from a heated pipe. This method is typically favored by frequent users with high tolerance as an alternative to intravenous use. Nevertheless, while it avoids the risk of bloodborne diseases or infections, it can damage the respiratory system and can cause tooth and mouth damage with frequent use. Another possible route of administration is the intravenous method, often highly popular among chronic users. This method carries the highest risks due to several factors, including its highest bioavailability, possibly resulting in an overdose. Moreover, since the drug enters the bloodstream directly, present impurities of street methamphetamine may damage the vascular system. In general, it's strongly advisable to avoid this method altogether. The last two methods, rectal and vaginal, are not particularly popular and widespread among the users, yet some may prefer them to other methods due to their high bioavailability and relatively rapid onset. In any case, both methods pose a significant risk of overdose and local tissue damage, possibly resulting in necrosis, especially with frequent use. Precisely due to these adverse effects, it's strongly discouraged to use methamphetamine in such a manner. Anyway, let's take a look at those two graphs on the right side. As depicted, regional preferences in methamphetamine administration vary, with US users leaning towards inhalation while European users favoring intranasal use. However, it is worth noting that European statistics also include users of regular amphetamine, thus they might not be completely representative. Now let's explore the oral dosing of methamphetamine. As usual, these dosing ranges are based on user reports from sources like Psychonaut Wiki and Erowid. Also, all dose ranges are based upon an assumption that the user is taking a relatively pure methamphetamine hydrochloride and has a low tolerance. Anyway, feel free to pause the video to review dosing ranges for other modes of use. So the threshold dose is 5 mg, while a light dose falls between 5 to 50 mg. On the other hand, common doses range from 10 to 40 mg, with a strong dose ranging from 40 to 60 mg. A relatively heavy dose for those with low tolerance is 60 mg or higher, and an excessive dose, potentially endangering the user, is 150 mg and beyond. In any case, for individuals with high tolerance, this dose may not necessarily lead to overdose, as some tolerant users report doses exceeding 200 mg, though the quality of the substance they are taking raises some skepticism. So when considering the duration of effects from orally ingested methamphetamine, onset typically occurs within 15 to 70 minutes after administration. Nevertheless, the consumption of a fatty food may slightly delay absorption, due to which the onset of action may take up to 70 minutes. However, it's important to note that overall bioavailability remains unaffected, with approximately 67% of the dose still entering the system. The difference simply lies in delayed onset of initial effects. In any case, the come-up phase ranges from 1 to 3 hours after ingestion, with peak effects lasting anywhere between 3 to 5 hours. In addition, inexperienced users who take a high oral dose may experience peak effects for up to 6 hours. The decline in effects, or offset, typically occurs within 2 to 6 hours, while residual effects such as peripheral stimulation may persist for 12 to 24 hours, which is especially the case for high doses. In summary then, the effects of orally administered methamphetamine last between 8 to 12 hours with a common dose and up to 24 hours with a strong or heavy dose. The range of psychological effects induced by methamphetamine may span from mild mental stimulation and a subtle mood lift to intense mental stimulation accompanied by profound feelings of well-being, euphoria, and overwhelming bliss. This is particularly notable with moderate to high doses administered intravenously or when inhaled. Methamphetamine's effects also include heightened alertness and increased focus. However, as the dose escalates, so do the adverse psychological effects, such as racing thoughts, paranoia, agitation, and inflated sense of self-importance. Furthermore, low doses of methamphetamine may induce weak empathogenic effects in first-time or infrequent users with low tolerance, though these effects tend to diminish with continued use. These mild empathogenic effects are a distinguishing feature of methamphetamine when compared to regular amphetamine and are believed to stem from its heightened serotonergic activity. In summary, the positive psychological effects of methamphetamine may encompass mood enhancement, euphoria, mental stimulation, improved concentration, enhanced focus, increased thought organization, increased sociability, and heightened libido and sexual drive. Neutral effects may include excessive talking, accelerated thoughts, and time compression. Conversely, negative psychological effects may manifest as ego inflation, compulsive redosing, and mental overstimulation, accompanied by racing thoughts, anxiety, paranoia, irritability, and agitation. Additionally, when overdosed, acute toxic psychosis invoking aggressive behavior and tactile hallucinations may occur. The physiological effects of methamphetamine are characterized by heightened sympathetic activity, inducing an increased heart rate and blood pressure. Moreover, the increased sympathetic response may also result in muscle tremors, increased perspiration, and teeth grinding. Also, at the high range of the dose spectrum, the physiological stimulation produced by meth can become forced, thus leading to jaw clenching, involuntarily bodily shakes and vibrations, resulting in the general lack of motor control. Additionally, moderate to high doses may induce physiological euphoria, characterized by a pleasurable tingling sensation that can spread throughout the body. This effect is then particularly noticeable with intravenous use or high oral doses. Interestingly, low-tolerance users may experience slight entactogenic effects, which seem to be associated with methamphetamine's increased serotonergic activity. Nevertheless, these entactogenic effects tend to be less pronounced than those induced by MDMA. Altogether, the positive physiological effects of methamphetamine may include physiological stimulation and euphoria, increased stamina, fine motor skill enhancement, heightened tactile sensitivity, and bronchodilation. Neutral effects may then manifest as increased heart rate, decreased appetite, changes in body odor, increased perspiration, frequent urination, pupil dilation, and dry mouth. On the other hand, negative physiological effects might include elevated blood pressure, abnormal heartbeat, dehydration, elevated body temperature, muscle tremors, neurotoxicity, cardiotoxicity, teeth grinding, involuntary movements, and temporary erectile dysfunction. In some rare instances, methamphetamine can induce various visual effects, including double vision, which is quite often a symptom of sleep deprivation. Another visual effect is visual drifting, which may occur when combining methamphetamine with substances like cannabinoids, dissociatives, or psychedelics. In a similar manner to amphetamine, methamphetamine may cause visual brightness alteration, typically manifesting in a perceived increase in the brightness of one's surroundings. Transformation is another visual effect, characterized by a perceived metamorphosis of objects in the environment. This effect is rare and usually occurs with high doses during the calm-down phase or after prolonged periods of wakefulness. Moreover, when combined with cannabinoids, dissociatives, and psychedelics, methamphetamine may also produce visual hallucinations, akin to those induced by deliriums. In addition to visual effects, methamphetamine may invoke auditory hallucinations, which are often a symptom of acute toxic psychosis or severe sleep deprivation. Aside from that, meth-induced toxic psychosis may also be accompanied by tactile hallucinations. Now this time, I won't delve deeply into the neurobiological mechanisms of meth addiction and withdrawal development, as I would be pretty much repeating myself, since the general mechanism is pretty much the same as with amphetamine. Hence, if you'd like to learn more about the mechanism of methamphetamine addiction and withdrawal development, feel free to watch the 5th part of the amphetamine series. And yeah, don't forget to turn on the subtitles, since the video is in Czech. Alright, now let's get back to meth withdrawal. So, methamphetamine withdrawal typically emerges within 24 to 72 hours after cessation of use. This delayed onset is due to the relatively long biological half-life of methamphetamine. Now let's briefly turn our attention to the figures on the right side, illustrating PET brain scans of the control group and experimental group of participants consisting of cocaine, alcohol, heroin, and meth users. So, as depicted in the first figure, prolonged use of drugs including meth decreases the overall availability of D2 dopaminergic receptors, which in the case of meth translates to increased tolerance to the drug's effects as well as the manifestation of a hypodopaminergic state, invoking symptoms of psychological withdrawal after discontinuation of use, such as loss of motivation to engage in previously satisfying activities like hobbies. On the other hand, the second PET figure illustrates a loss of dopamine transporters following long-term meth use, which contributes to tolerance development and the overall dysregulation of the dopaminergic system. In any case, with prolonged periods of abstinence, a gradual increase in the availability of these transporters can be observed, indicating that this loss is reversible. Alright, now let's get back to meth withdrawal. So the general intensity of meth withdrawal ranges from moderate to severe, depending on the length of use, daily intake, and individual differences. Unlike withdrawal from drugs like alcohol, meth withdrawal is predominantly psychological in nature, though some individuals may experience physiological signs, such as muscle pain. Altogether, the withdrawal syndrome can be divided into 3 phases, with the first phase lasting anywhere from between 1 to 7 or 10 days. This stage is marked by the highest intensity of symptoms, which may include intense cravings, depression, and anhedonia. The second phase then lasts between 2 to 4 or 5 weeks and sees reduced intensity of symptoms, which may consist of cravings and depression. The final phase, called protracted withdrawal, lasting between 6 to 12 months, is then typically associated with heavy meth use and milder yet persisting symptoms, including cravings, affective distress, and cognitive deficits like decreased cognitive control, which together may pose a risk of relapse, especially when left untreated. Now, unfortunately, there's no established pharmacological treatment for meth addiction and withdrawal. Thus, psychotherapy remains the primary approach, though some older studies suggest that dopamine agonists like methylphenidate may help with reducing the intensity of cravings. Unfortunately, a more recent meta-analysis on this matter concluded that there is a lack of evidence regarding the efficacy of dopamine agonist therapy when dealing with methamphetamine withdrawal. However, 2 recent randomized controlled clinical trials indicated that corticotrophin-releasing factor antagonist oxazarfont and partial-more opiate receptor agonist buprenorphine, currently used to treat opioid use disorder, may be effective in managing cravings during withdrawal. The symptoms of methamphetamine withdrawal closely resemble those of amphetamine withdrawal, encompassing psychological manifestations such as cravings, dysphoria, irritability, anxiety, depression, and even psychosis. In some instances, physiological symptoms may also arise, including hypersomnia, insomnia, and hyperphagia, that is, an insatiable hunger sensation. Additionally, individuals undergoing withdrawal may experience muscle pain, muscle rigidity, and bradycardia. These symptoms are then partially mediated by the hyperactive body's stress response system, which comprises the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal glands. When activated, the hypothalamus releases corticotrophin-releasing factor hormone into the pituitary glands, stimulating the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone to the adrenal glands. This cascade prompts the release of stress hormone like adrenaline and cortisol, which suppress immune system activity and perpetuate the cycle by signaling the hypothalamus to continue the process. In this section, you can explore the potential risks of interactions between methamphetamine and other substances. I've also outlined potential psychophysiological symptoms, with a plus sign indicating an increased likelihood or intensity of the perceived symptoms of the interaction, and a minus sign suggesting a decreased likelihood or intensity. Bear in mind that I did not include all of the possible symptoms of all possible interactions, and that this table is pretty much just orientational and thus should be taken with a bit of a grain of salt. Anyway, I will not be delving into this topic any deeper, and instead I will move on to the final part of this video. Alright, now let's dive into the final chapter of this video, which focuses on signs of methamphetamine overdose. In any case, bear in mind that the symptoms outlined here are among the more prominent ones. Nevertheless, there are numerous others to be aware of. So, from a psychological standpoint, individuals may experience agitation, anxiety, paranoia, irritability, and acute toxic psychosis, which can lead to hallucinations and aggressive behavior. On the physical side, one may encounter arrhythmias, chest pains, shortness of breath, hypothermia, heart attack, hypertension, hypotension, rhabdomyolysis, kidney damage, gastrointestinal distress, intracranial hemorrhage, seizures, coma, and even death. In the case that you would like to learn more about methamphetamine's effects affecting the human body, feel free to pause the video and dissect the figure describing short-term and long-term positive and negative psychophysiological effects at your convenience. Anyway, that would be pretty much all from my side for today. And as always, if you found the video informative, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. In the following video, I'll be analyzing diacetylmorphine, commonly known as heroin. For more information on drugs, feel free to visit the drug library portal linked in the description below. Ta-ta and have a good one, and obviously stay safe when doing drugs.